All right. Well, it's a minute past and we're going to get started because we'll probably end a little early and give you some time back in your day. My name's Catherine Brocklehurst and I'm the VP of Marketing here at Bayshore Networks. And I'll be moderating our talk today. But largely, Toby will run the talk. And then at the end, if there are questions, we'll take those and I'll help get those into his attention. So I'm going to turn it over to him in a moment. I just want you to know that this is a man, the only chief product officer that I know of who's been out at customer sites installing product. And I think that his long years and background in this space is really useful for helping to make sure customers get what they want. And he is the product guy to help that kind of input. So I'm going to turn it over to Toby now. And Toby, take it away.
Thank you, Catherine, and good morning, good afternoon to everyone. We've got participants from a few different corners of the world, so I appreciate you all making the time to learn a little bit about what we're doing with OT Access. I'm gonna run you through a few different aspects of the presentation today, but the main thing really is to focus on some simple lessons. So what we're going to start with is a little bit of history. Both the company's history and then some of the perspective that I'd like to bring to bear on it. Obviously, a little bit about the technology. We'll give you some details about how OT Access works and broadly how Bayshore works. And then hopefully the benefit of sort of some of our past experiences, things we've seen at customer sites and particular lessons learned when we've gone to do deployments or otherwise had conversations with people who are actually doing the work. Those are obviously the stakeholders that we're most concerned about. We want to ensure that people are successful and that this is an improvement to their workflow. So we'll be talking a lot about some of those things. One of the things that I feel is really valuable about OT Access is that it's that rare security solution which also improves convenience. And it improves it, as you'll see, in a very straightforward way by enabling remote access, which means you don't have to go to physical sites, you don't have to roll a truck. And we do so, we believe, while improving the overall security of the OT access. So we'll show you how that works as well. So I joined Bayshore I guess about 2 years ago. And the reason I came here was having spent a long time on the IT security side of the industry. I had developed a certain set of opinions, I guess, about how customers evaluate and purchase security solutions on the IT side. And one of the interesting things that I kept noticing was that on the IT side, what we were really doing was selling solutions to improve, I guess, the availability of tools and workflow for people to deal with events, and process information, handle alerts, make policy decisions, things like that. That was fine, but the solutions were not really about reducing the scope of the losses themselves in the event that a loss still occurred. You might reduce the speed of expansion of a vulnerability or the degree of exploit across a network. But at the end of the day, if there was some financial loss, it was usually underwritten either by a corporate insurance policy or by some sort of federal program or some other reassignment of the cost. And on the industrial side, that's not really true. On the industrial side, if you are manufacturing widgets or you're a water plant or you're dealing with food and beverage packaging or whatever it might be, if you have a problem which compromises the ability of your environment to operate, the loss in terms of both the practical inability to do your job and the PR consequences are borne directly by you. Your entity absorbs the financial costs of recovery. You have to pass on those costs to ratepayers if you're a utility. You may go out of business if you're a private enterprise. The immediacy of the risk here was a big part of why I wanted to make the move into the industrial space. And so when I arrived at Bayshore, I looked at what the company had been doing for the first few years of its existence, and it had some really, really strong technology. And what we wanted to do was take those core technology assets and turn them into a new set of products. And we did so in observation of these objectives. The first one here is that no matter what, any solution we drop into an environment has to have zero impact on operational risk. So we cannot increase the likelihood that the plant goes offline or misbehaves. And this is an important distinction, right? On the IT side, generally speaking, if your security tools trigger, it is acceptable for them to shut down activity. It is acceptable for them to cut things off while analysis and response takes place. And on the industrial side, that's not really true. It's not acceptable to simply turn off a large lift pump in a water plant and decrease the plant's capacity by 20% or 50% or whatever it is. It's not acceptable to stop rolling product off the assembly line and into the trucks. We recognize there's still a risk that could happen, but it's not an appropriate response in the face of a security incident. So protecting OT assets without having any reasonable expectation of impacting operations was objective number one. The second objective is this notion that a lot of the problems that occur are because these OT networks are generally fairly flat. They don't have a lot of segmentation. They don't have a lot of access control. They often have a lot of physical connectivity points, which are essentially unsupervised. You can walk up to a cabinet and there's probably a little switch in there with an open port, and you can plug your laptop into that port and see the whole network. More and more plants have wireless access points, which are even more permissive. And so the danger in terms of what real risks are threatening operations are mostly to do with unexpected stuff that happens with what's meant to be there. These permissive networks generally, because they're not explicitly filtering out a lot of these dangerous activities, an engineer with a workstation can plug in and start running software that can reprogram PLCs or make other significant changes to how the environment works. And so what we're trying to do is reduce the risk of those unauthorized or unexpected communications. The network level exploits that target the native OEM equipment, those are scary, and there's a lot of good work being done on identifying those vulnerabilities and notifying the OEM so they can be fixed. But in practical terms, the real problems that come up more and more often are to do with just people making mistakes. Trusted individuals, third parties who are allowed on site, people running different versions of software, loading a different program into a PLC that they didn't realize was no longer correct. All those sorts of things happen a lot. And the challenge there is, the challenge there is how do we, protect the plants from those environments? And then finally, what can we do to protect the plants with the tools they already have and the people they already have and the skills they already have? The current tool set, the current in-house expertise. That's really critical. And the reality is most of these customer sites, they can't afford to rip and replace the entire network. They can't suddenly staff up a whole bunch of native security analysis skills. Even if they could find them, it would be very difficult to keep them. And so the objectives in building these products is really all about what can we do with what you have to make you successful, doing the things that you already know how to do. Well, there we go. So to do that, we've created 3 products. Obviously, today we're going to talk about OT Access, but Bayshore also offers 2 other major products. SCADA Fuse is an endpoint protection product. So those cabinets and those PLCs, SCADA Fuse sits right down there at the end of the line and protects those. SCADA Wall is a product designed to provide secure segmentation for very high value assets. So, if you're interested, we can tell you more about that. But OT Access is the one we're here to talk about today, which is a remote access solution specifically for OT assets. It's designed to span the entire spectrum of a typical Purdue model. So on the left side, you see we've got third-party users. They're external. They could be employees, they could be contractors, but they are outside the network entirely, not just outside OT, but outside the entire enterprise network. And yet they need to get all the way down to level 1. They need to talk to assets and endpoints that are doing the real work and running the plant. And OT Access is a mechanism that's designed to allow that to happen. I'll show you a little bit about how it works. As a product set, it's available in two different deployment models. So there is a hosted version where there's zero hardware footprint. And then there's an on-site version where you have a server that sits in your DMZ and acts as the linchpin for all of this. But in any case, the important features of the product are really boiled down to three major areas. The first is that we operate entirely in native OT protocols. So what we're doing is not simply enabling an overall network connection like a VPN. With a VPN, you authenticate, you log in, and then anything that's accessible behind that VPN, you can see. And for general purpose enterprise applications, that's perfectly fine. And there are lots of good products in that category. But what we're interested in are a much narrower set of services. If you have a PLC, a Modicon PLC, a Siemens PLC, a VFD, any of these sorts of assets, they have very specific network communications requirements and nothing else. There's no reason to enable access to every port on a device when the services are only present on, say, Modbus or Ethernet IP or whatever it might be. So OT access is designed to start at the very bottom and enable only the minimum possible access necessary to provide the individual with a degree of access that allows them to do their work. So that's the first key difference. The second difference is continuous monitoring. So what we're looking at is the duration of the session and every instruction, every function code, every parameter that goes with a function code that the user is sending down the line. We want to validate against whether or not that should be permitted according to the policy that's been assigned. And you can think about this in very simple terms. If we give you a read-only policy and you then try to perform a write, you push a new value to a register or you try to even do a programming update to a device, those are write or full access operations and they're blocked. You're not allowed to do them because the policy says you're not permitted. But if you continue to try and do reads, you can keep going. We don't disconnect the session. We simply filter out the individual instructions that are problematic. We generate an alert so the administrator can look into it. But you're allowed to keep doing what you're meant to be doing on the basis that there was probably a legitimate reason to give you access in the first place. The third difference is ultimately to do with the sort of purpose build. So we're not trying to be a general purpose remote access tool for all networks and all applications. OT access is only intended for these specific use cases around OT. And that focus gives us the ability to exclude a lot of other features that would compromise the security model of what we're trying to build. And this is essential because we feel that the nature of these permissive OT networks is, it makes it easy to get things done, but it also increases the risk that people can do the wrong things. Let me show you a little bit about how it works. So on one side, we have the targets. These are the things that we want to get to from afar. These are the endpoints that need to be connected to. We don't want to touch them. We don't want to reconfigure anything. We don't want to add any software to them or require firmware changes or change the networking or anything. These are existing, they work, we want to leave them that way. On the other side, we have users, external users that need to get to them somehow. So what do we do to enable that? The first part is the user has to authenticate to the first part of the OT access solution. And as I mentioned previously, that can either be a cloud or a server. In either case, it works the same way. The user logs in, we optionally verify them using your Active Directory server, and we use two-factor authentication to confirm the credential is in use appropriately. So we log in, the user connects, they can see things, fantastic. The second piece then is we show them what services they're allowed to touch. Those services are provided by this device, the endpoint gateway. That's the one which knows which endpoints are permitted at all and under what conditions they are permitted. It reports that back to the server or the cloud with an outbound only SSL connection. So the only way for this to work is if the endpoint can get to the server or the cloud with an SSL connection, and that's persistent. Once that connection is established, we maintain it, and then all future user activity can come back down that same tunnel and then proxied by the endpoint gateway into the native protocol. in order to connect to the endpoint they're allowed to see. The enforcement, the supervision of policy that I mentioned previously, all takes place in that server or in that cloud. So if there is a violation, the instruction, which is the problem, never enters the OT network at all. It is filtered out and alerted before it ever starts down that SSL tunnel. And this is important, right? We don't want rogue instructions getting into the network, and creating a risk. So that's the way the architecture is meant to work. Now, the only real difference between the hosted model and the on-site model is essentially where that policy enforcement takes place. If you use the hosted model, you get a cloud that we provision for you, and we manage that cloud. So you simply use it as a service. If you have the on-site model, you can have the server or multiple servers, depending on your network, but the user experience is otherwise identical. So it's really a question of whether you want to own that physical server and have possession of all the data that is used to create the access rules and the policy enforcement, or if you are able to use a cloud model. But otherwise, the user experience is identical. So let me just show you a little bit about how this works. What we have here is a scenario where a user has connected. You can see the green list of services are the ones that the user is allowed to see. And at the top here, there's a simple a Modbus policy. Now, as we start the video, you can see here's the Modbus policy. It's enabled, and we have a little Modbus client that's running on our local workstation. What we're going to try and do is connect to it with a read. We're going to read 6 different registers and see whether or not we can get values back. We perform a scan, and what we get are 6 different values, and they update as the registers themselves update. This is all happening in real time through the OT access connection, all the way down the line to the PLC we're connecting to. Now we switch into the administrative interface and we look at the policy, and the policy was enabled as an all access policy. This is why no matter what we do, it'll work. We're going to change it to a read-only policy. We're going to make sure that we're in enforcement mode. We save those changes. Okay. And we go back, and you'll notice the user hasn't disconnected and reconnected. We've made this policy change while the session is ongoing. And now what you'll see with the local client, oh, wait, oh dear, my PowerPoint just quit. I'm very sorry. Give me a moment. We'll get right back to it.
While he's bringing that back, I'll just remind everyone down at the bottom of your screen inside the Zoom, there's a Q&A area. And if you begin to have questions toward the end, because we are getting toward the end, feel free to submit those there, and then we'll have them at the ready for when we get to the Q&A part.
All right, did it come back up?
It did.
Okay, good. Yep, sorry about that. I'm not quite sure why I did that, but we'll let's see if we can skip forward in the video a little bit. Okay, we saw that part, we saw the values, we made the change, we saved them. Okay, here we go. So now we're back to where we were. As I said, the user has not logged off and logged on again. We've changed it to a read-only policy. They can still read the values from the registers, which is what you would expect. But now we stop the scanning on a read function, and we change it to a write function. Choose a new write instruction, and we're going to try and write a specific value to register number 1. And what you'll find is that the client can no longer do it. They're blocked, and that's because of the policy enforcement that we just enabled. So this is really the essence of what we're trying to do. It's a continuous monitoring. The administrator retains full ownership over what goes on, and they ultimately can pick and choose exactly what access is appropriate for the work that the individual needs to perform.
Toby, a
Yeah.
question came in that's very timely, and I thought I would pose it right now.
Sure.
In that demo, just to explain a tad further, can you give access on a schedule or expire their access?
You can. So we have the ability to set either a permanent schedule for any individual user and policy, or to grant a schedule on the basis of an exception. So for example, if you have somebody doing remote maintenance, and you know that every Thursday they have a 2-hour window to perform diagnostics, something of that sort. You can define that 2-hour window as part of the schedule for that policy. And outside of that window, they can't connect at all. Inside that window, they can connect. But the other thing you can do is if you have, say, an ongoing read-only policy, and you know that someone needs to do some work, do some updating, you can give a temporary schedule for elevating their privilege. So you can elevate them to a full access policy for the next 90 minutes or whatever it might be. And then it automatically expires and returns back to the read-only policy at the end of that window. And this is, oh, go ahead.
Do we use digital keys?
I need a little more detail on what that would mean.
Okay, let's hold that to the end, then continue. And to the person that asked that question, we'll take that at the end, and we'll get it set up. Thanks. Just carry on.
Sure. So the comparisons that we like, that, well, certainly that we're asked about and that we like to talk about, are usually between OT access and VPNs. So what we have here, and again, you'll have access to the slides and the recordings at the end of this session, but what you have here are some of the essential differences. I mentioned a couple of them already. We do support these native OT protocols for full inspection and intrusion prevention. We offer both the hosted and on-site models, which is fine. But we offer the policy enforcement, and that requires us to know all the native function codes, all the native operations that are ongoing for the duration of every session in order to perform that function. And in the hosted model, we offer an easy way to do multi-site management with different policies, different user bases, all of that kind of distinction. So if you want to operate it as a managed service, which some of our customers like to do, they essentially act as a managed service provider on behalf of all their different third-party suppliers. We can do that, and this is not a model that you see in a conventional VPN. As far as zero trust networking tools, again, we're not just about encrypting traffic that's already there. And the distinction really that's important is, encrypting the traffic is fine, but that's sort of plumbing. And what we really care about is not just the plumbing, but also the quality of the inputs and the effects on the outputs. And this is ultimately the value add that we think is very important as far as what OT Access provides. Looking at conventional firewalls or firmware-based solutions, which are OEM specific, again, an IT firewall will sit at the perimeter, and once you're connected, there's sort of a Wild West. There's not a lot of restriction on what you can do behind that. And the problem there is, if you don't have any monitoring or any supervision of what they're doing, the danger is that they might do something unintentional, which causes a problem. And as far as the firmware-based tools, there's such a heavy lift required to enable them that realistically most customers simply cannot expect, to do that in any kind of reasonable time frame. So if we review some of the key features, ultimately this is a very specific purpose-built solution for remote access into OT networks and assets. We're providing the customer with the ability to do full policy enforcement on a per user, per session, per endpoint basis. And at least as far as the hosted model is concerned, there's no hardware at all. We can set you up in a day or less and you can be off to the races. We do integrate with AD, we do provide user and security group authentication. And because we're not requiring you to punch a hole through your perimeter firewall into that endpoint, you get the advantage of protecting the OT network itself without exposing it to the internet, and yet enabling remote access, again, on this very specific narrow focus basis. In terms of what makes this different, that outbound only connection is really crucial. We're not simply tunneling VPNs or tunneling remote desktop into the environment because the endpoint gateway is initiating all those connections. We offer the full traffic inspection and restrictions, as I've mentioned previously, and we recognize that the needs for OT remote access are different than those for IT remote access, which is why we offer this as a unique and separate tool. Ultimately, if you want to use clientless connections for certain protocols, we offer that as well. You don't have to use a desktop client application to connect to it. So you can just do a web-based clientless authentication. We support SAML authentication if you have that infrastructure set up. And at the end of the day, this is a quality and safety and assurance tool for verifying that people only do the work they're meant to do. And even if they make a mistake, they're protected from having that mistake ultimately have any cascading consequences. A couple use cases to talk about. This is a situation for a large consumer goods manufacturing customer. They use the hosted version to protect roughly 60 manufacturing facilities around the world. They had, about 36 different third-party suppliers that wanted access for one reason or another, and many of them wanted to bring their own tools to bear. The goal was, what can we do to give a single pane of glass for monitoring those connections, restricting access, permitting or revoking access control, and ultimately not having a huge IT headache of maintaining so many different solution sets. So this has been rolled out worldwide in that scenario, and they've been using this solution now for almost 3 years at this point. Another situation with an industrial manufacturer. They're using it on 2 different levels. The first is for their own employees to get to their own remote locations. They have specialist teams that need to supervise different aspects of their operations around the world. But the second thing they're doing is enabling, through their own maintenance contracts to their own customers, they're delivering those maintenance obligations through OT access tunnels. And again, this becomes just embedded into the broader business activity that they perform today. So the customer, they simply receive the technology requirements, set those up as part of the installation of the industrial equipment. And then going forward, they have, obviously the experience that the OEM is providing on their behalf. Now, for the purposes of the current circumstances, Bayshore has made the decision to offer 90-day evaluations at no cost for customers that want to explore OT access as a solution. So what we'll do is provide you with capacity in a hosted instance that we provide. There are no volume or performance limitations. There's no functionality limitations of any sort. You can use the entire solution in your environment with your devices, in whatever terms you want. So please do contact us if you'd like to evaluate that. There's a registration page you can land on. I think it's the same one that you may have used to register for the webinar. Or just send us an email and indicate, your interest, and we'll follow up with you directly to get it up and running. And ultimately, that's the proposition for today. I know we've had some questions come in, so Catherine, I'll hand it back to you, and we'll run through the questions.
Okay, thank you. Back to the question about the digital key. The question really is, do the administrators out at the users, the administrator, do they have to give the user that they're enabling a digital key linked to the host? Or is
no, I think if we're talking about things like certificates, no, they don't have to. You have the option of loading your own. If you have a certificate authority in-house, you can use your own server certificates for the on-site server. But we don't use X509 certificates for authentication. So at the moment, no, that's not something that we require.
Okay, and then so the kinds of, so it's pretty strictly a username, password, and 2-factor.
That's right. The second factors are typically either SMS or just an out-of-band email with a verification code.
Okay, and then how do credentials work in environments that don't have Active Directory?
Then we just maintain the user repository locally within either the cloud or the server. So you don't have to use AD. You can set up and manage your own user records just entirely within the service.
Okay, great. And a question, is there a subscription fee for the hosted service? And I think our 90-day offer is a little different than what might be the norm. So go ahead and answer that.
Yeah, so the hosted solution is delivered on a subscription basis. So the normal commercial model is you identify how many users and how many endpoints, and there's a simple matrix that tells you what subscription level is available for you. And you would look at typically a 1, 2, or 3 year subscription for that. So that's very easy. It's obviously very predictable. There are no throttling or usage constraints or other metering factors that go into it once you're signed up. If you look at the on-site version, there's a fixed cost to purchase the server, and there's a small, medium, and large designation around the server, and then you own it going forward. So you can use it up to the license limits of the version you've purchased. But again, there's no bandwidth restrictions, there's no total volume transferred restrictions or anything like that. So it's a fully flexible deployment, based on whatever size you purchase.
And then based on our offer just for the free usage during this period, what would happen at the end of 90 days?
So at the end of 90 days, if you want to proceed with it, then obviously we'll be happy to discuss how to extend it. We don't want to, lose any configurations you've set up or, any policies you've defined. So, if you decide, for example, that you wanted to migrate from the hosted model of the trial to an on-site model, then that's a migration we can enable for you. If you want to move to your own dedicated cloud, we can enable that as well. So there are various different migration paths available if you want to continue after 90 days.
Okay. And what OS does the client version run on?
So the standard client-based access is a small Windows application. But as I think I mentioned at one point, there is also a clientless login, which just uses a browser. So there's a browser-based authentication that's provided. That's also available to be used for essentially machine-to-machine based communications. So if you want to use, for example, a SAML-based authentication handshake for an application to connect in, that's another solution that we can set up for you, or that you can manage on your own. So there's really no restrictions. So long as you can at least run a basic browser, you should be able to log in and get into the solution.
Okay. Does a pre-existing VPN or remote access product need to be set up, and your device work as an accompaniment to that, or how does that work?
No, you don't need a separate VPN to use our solution. You may well have a VPN, which you're using, for other enterprise applications. But our counsel is that no, you don't need a VPN into the OT space at all. We provide the full equivalent functionality of that, just with a much narrower scope of access for an individual session.
Right. So as I understood it, our connectivity from the end user, the user of this solution, to the device they're accessing is encrypted. So
That's
similar.
correct.
Okay.
It's encrypted from the user's desktop to the cloud or the server. It's then encrypted again from the cloud or server to the endpoint gateway. And then finally, it's released back to the native protocol for whatever the session is. If that's an encrypted native protocol, then we don't change that. It remains encrypted. But if it's a plain text protocol like Modbus, for example, then it's delivered in the native format back to the asset you're connecting to. So, we don't release it into native format until we're already authenticated and delivered into the OT network itself.
Okay. And if somebody's interested in this and they want to know who our distributors are, who might you name here?
Well, it depends on where you are in the world. For US-based inquiries, we would steer you towards the Automatech family, which includes Automatech, Symtech, Advanced Industrial, CB Pacific. All of those are distributors for us. We also have relationships based on a more regional basis. We have distributors up and down the mid-Atlantic coast. We have Delta Automation, we have Brown Engineering, we have a number of others that are available depending on where you are in the country. So if you're looking for an intersection, if you send us an email, just let us know where you are and we will steer you towards the appropriate local contact.
Right. And our website also shares some of who those folks
That's
are.
right.
And one last question, I think, unless others have posed one, is what if I'm the administrator and I have third parties that aren't our employees that I want to be able to, like if I have somebody from Schneider and they come in usually on some schedule to do some maintenance, how does this work?
So as far as we're concerned, that's entirely up to you. We don't have any restriction on that. So we do have customers that will create a special security group in their Active Directory, for example, for third parties. which defines obviously a more reduced set of access and permissions within AD. But as far as we're concerned, we authenticate them the same way and to the same standards. So it's actually quite a good way to manage access control for third-party contractors and maintenance and all the rest of it. So the the user experience is the same. It's up to the administrator to decide whether they want to restrict access on the basis of that third-party status.
Okay, great. All right, well, I think that's it for the questions I received, and all of you who have attended and stayed so attentive throughout, thank you so much for joining us in your day. And with any questions further that you may have or any contact you'd like to make, you all have my email. This is a recorded session, which we will make publicly available for archive. So if you have others in your organization that could not join and you'd like them to see it, you will get the archive link following this webinar. Not immediately following the webinar, but soon. And then for the slides that we offered, which will not include that little video demo, but if you want to just have the slides that Toby has presented, we will provide those to you very shortly also. So again, thank you for everyone who's joined. And we will end the webinar now. Thank you.
Thank you very much for attending.